Okay, we are live. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as a way to begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to MFT Worldwide's Honoring the Pioneers series. Tonight we are honoring the work of Steve de Shazer, the great Steve de Shazer, one of the most influential figures in the field of strength-based approaches to mental health. Steve is the co-founder of Solution-Focused Therapy, and tonight we'll be hearing from two people who have had close personal and professional relationships with Steve. My name is Paul Mayoni, and I'm the co-founder of MFTWorldwide.com. I'd like to introduce you to our very special guest this evening. Yvonne Dolan is a longtime colleague and friend of the late Steve de Shazer and Insoo Kim Berg, original developers of Solution-Focused Therapy, and taught at their Milwaukee Brief Family Therapy Center. She is past president and co-founder with Steve and Insoo of the Solution-Focused Brief Therapy Association, and co-founder of the Institute for Solution-Focused Therapy. Yvonne's books and articles on solution-focused brief therapy have been translated into 7 languages. And to learn more about or to contact Yvonne, you can visit her at solutionfocused.net. We also have the pleasure of Wendel being with us this evening. He has been an individual, couple, and family therapist for more than 30 years. He is professor of family systems at the College of Arts, Education, and Sciences at the University of Louisiana in Monroe. Wendel is a senior research fellow and former director of the Mental Research Institute, the MRI, and founding director of the Don D. Jackson Archive of Systemic Literature. Wendel's authored 100 juried articles and book chapters and over 10 books available in 8 languages, and is frequently invited to brief therapy, applied systems theory, and forums nationally throughout Europe, Asia, and Central America. And to learn more about the Don D. Jackson Archive, you can visit the MRI website at mri.org. Thank you both so much for being here today. I thought a good place for us to start out would be to share with us how you first met Steve de Shazer and what that meeting was like. Who would like to begin?
I don't remember. Steve has just been so much there for so long. I think I met him in an elevator, frankly, just to be at some conference, and I told him how much I admired his work, and he says, "That's your problem." I remember that. I don't remember. How about you, Yvonne?
Yeah,
Do you remember?
I had been aware of his work through the Underground Railroad, yes, which was a sort of a wonderful, very, very simple, what was that called that they used to, mimeograph?
Yes, it was a newsletter of sorts.
A newsletter, wonderful pieces about brief therapy. And I had been very desperate. In New Orleans, I was working with very traumatized, homeless adolescents, and I was desperate for anything practical I could use, and so I got very interested in Steve and Insoo's work. And then my partner at the time, Charlie Johnson, and I decided that we would contact the Brief Family Therapy Center, and we flipped a coin, and I lost the bet, and I was very, very shy. I am a very shy person. And to my horror, when I called, Steve de Shazer answered the phone. And I remember just being speechless and stammering and confiding to him that I said, I'm so sorry, I'm probably not making sense. I'm so in awe of you, and I'm a very shy person. Little did I know that I was talking to one of the shyest people on earth. And by the end of the conversation, it wasn't a long conversation, but it seemed very long to me. It was probably a 10-minute conversation. Steve said that Charlie and I should come, and we would study with them, we would stay with them. And I said, well, what will the cost be? Because, we want to make sure we can afford it. And he said, oh, it'll cost you, but you'll be able to afford it. And so we came, and we stayed in Steve and Insu's guest room and visited the team. And back then, it was like Camelot. I mean, the exchange of ideas between people like Michelle Weiner Davis and Eve Lipchick and let's see, Gail Miller was there. I think Wally Gingrich was there. Elam Nunnally. All these really brilliant people. And I remember just being quite thrilled with getting to listen to this. And they threw me on the team, literally, almost. I mean, not physically, but said, if you're going to be here, you have to participate. And I remember just feeling, overwhelmed, like I don't know enough. They said, well, yes, you do. And so that was kind of what happened. And the rest is history. We went back to Denver and started our own solution-focused team, and they began to visit very regularly, several times a year, and were generous and kind and spent all this time with our team, with us, and I just couldn't believe my good fortune.
You remind me of one of the times I met Steve. I was learning my trade. I was in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and under the supervision of someone, and had read Brief Family Therapy. And this knocked me out, this book, Steve's first book. So I started looking, this is pre-internet, clearly, and found that they did trainings. They had week-long trainings. You could do 4 in a row to get equivalent of a month, month-long trainings, et cetera, et cetera. I went for a 1-week, initial week-long, 40-hour-week training after having read this book, and that was extraordinary. I think certainly Eve, she has certainly influenced me. I meant to say Yvonne. I think Yvonne's experience was earlier than mine. Mine's about 1982. Well, this book came out in 82, so I'm thinking it was about 82. And what just so impressed me in this clinic, there were so many things. One photograph in the lobby, and that's Milton Erickson sitting in his wheelchair. These are things that are just coming to my mind, prompted by what Yvonne was just saying. Another one was seeing Steve in his office, and what is he reading? He has 3 volumes of Haley that Haley did on Erickson. So he's reading Erickson. I'm so in awe, like Yvonne mentioned. Having read this book, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this guy, this is a very knowledgeable person. And another remembrance I have of that is they were constructing the clinic as they went. I think they just moved into this, the second clinic they had, if I remember right. And they hadn't put in the windows, the one-way screen. Mm-hmm. So there's this big hole in the wall, right? And between one observation room and one therapy room. And Steve telling people, imagine there's a one-way screen.
Can you?
And so we're about, we mean, and there's probably, I don't know how many, 10, 15, 20 people in this cohort, and we're all sitting with the lights off, and both sides of the mirror are imagining that there's this one-way screen there. I was so impressed with that. And
well, it worked. It worked.
Yeah.
And I was never there during that time, but apparently early on, they started having sessions in their living room. That's how they began some of these sessions. And the team would sit on the stairway, and they would see clients in the living room, and it worked. And I think that they really exemplified how powerful congruency and clear positive intentions and careful use of language and listening can be. I mean, the fact that clients could respond to those outlandish situations and that it was still helpful. I mean, you know, it's something that many of us would have never dared to do, and it worked just fine.
That's right. That's right. There was a courage there.
Really, yeah.
You know?
And so many people may or may not know that Steve had a lot of connections to the MRI Institute. And I myself don't know too much about his time there or what his connection was specifically. Can you speak to that a bit?
Well, as I love the way I keep confusing you with Inzu, Yvonne. I can't remember where our list of questions are, but I think you said something like, what are our recollections of the relationship between Steve and MRI, Steve and or MRI and the solution-focused SFBT, and I really like how you outlined the question. And I have a lot of recollections. Some are recollections. Some are what I tend to do, which is get in the lit. I read. And so I know that Steve's first papers started hitting about the early 70s, about 74, it might be 72 in there somewhere. And that's about when the group therapy center's work started hitting, started getting published. 74 was a big year for MRI Group Therapy Center. But before that, the MRI, the Brief Therapy Center, John Weekland, Richard Fish, Paul Watzlawick, and others, got founded in 67? And that was a full decade after MRI had been in place. And MRI was a full decade after not a full decade, but 6 or 7 years after the MRI, after Gregory Bateson's research team, the Palo Alto team, had gotten together in Palo Alto. This is all happening in Palo Alto. And I do know that Steve was working at Family Services America in Palo Alto before somehow or another he and Inzu met when Inzu came to MRI to do training. And one thing leads to another, and he follows Inzu back to Milwaukee. And so there was a long relationship, close relationship, certainly between, I want to say John, but John and Dick, actually, and Steve. And their literature started hitting the journals about the same time, but I do think there was a mutual influence. The MRI rendition of MRI. Anyway, what about you, Yvonne?
Well, it's pretty similar. You know, I understand that Insu trained at MRI, but Steve, the way he described it was he hung out there when he could.
Yeah,
and of course, they fell madly in love, passionately in love there. And you could never get them to talk more about it than that. But that was what happened.
Well, let me say, one story I've heard, okay, now I wasn't there, so this is all make-believe, is that Steve was at John and Anna Wu's house having dinner. That's a pleasure I had a lot of times. And Anna says of Steve, after having met Inzu, I want to introduce them both to dinner. So I think Anna Wu might have had a hand in this connecting this petite Korean woman with Steve, and Anna Wu obviously is a petite woman from Shanghai, right?
That's great. I love it. That's great. That makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. I don't know if it's true, but I have heard it said. I can't remember who said it. Might have been, could have been John, could have been Anna Wu for that matter. Because she was no shy girl. She would tell you what she thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so we had talked about the role of language in Steve's work and how prominent that was. Can you speak to his interest in the precise use of language, and so much of his writings address the precise use of language? What can you recall about that?
Well, Steve was fascinated by Wittgenstein, and I'm now surmising from what Wendel has said that this probably got seeded even back at MRI. And he was a serious Wittgensteinian scholar, to the point that in his the German translation of his final book that we co-authored, he is described by the German logician Matthias Varga von Kibben as a Wittgensteinian scholar. So he really was a very serious student of Wittgenstein. And what I remember Steve saying so many times, don't interpret, just observe and describe. And it wasn't that he didn't like theory or philosophy. It's just that he felt very seriously that it could get in the way. So he advised his trainees to deliberately set aside explanations, hypotheses, fantasies, and especially interpretations about especially the cause of the problem, but even the complaint that the client brought to therapy, or the reason for coming, because he felt that it could distract people away from being able to discover the building blocks of the solution for the client's complaint, or the building blocks of a solution that involved the client being able to cope better with a difficult situation. So it was a very practical reason he had for utilizing this Wittgensteinian, very parsimonious way of using language and thinking. It also was a very good fit with Steve's personality. Steve was born and raised in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, but really has the persona more of a northern Wisconsin guy. These guys just don't use many words, and it's cultural. And I think that also may have influenced for Steve his desire to really understand Wittgenstein, because it made sense. Steve felt that if he was going to use words, he wanted to use them intentionally and use them effectively, in order to help clients. So that's what I remember. And I also remember, in terms of looking at the use of language, I hope I'm not rambling too much, that Steve felt that every response to a client should be formulated in such a way that it simultaneously communicated that the therapist had accurately understood everything the client had said up till now and wished the client well in some way. And that was just a basic thing, and then any other message could be better understood if that was included. So that was, for me, the way I thought Wittgenstein influenced Steve's work, and I suppose by extension MRI influenced his work.
Yeah.
Listen, I was so, just to be transparent, I think is a popular word right now. Yesterday we did a dry run to make sure this equipment worked. And I am always so inspired by Yvonne that she said, well, let's talk about these three things. and one being the relationship MRI, the BTC, blah, blah, blah. The other one, Steve's language use, and the other one's clinical. We'll get to his clinical work. Well, that made for a wonderful few hours between yesterday and today for me to go in and look at some of the things. And one of the things that I looked at was the first transcript of Gregory Bateson's research team in Palo Alto, preceded the MRI. John Weakland used to say, I like to talk about the MRI by talking about its prehistory, and the prehistory that he was referring to as the Palo Alto team. Anyway, the very earliest transcript of the team is, when is the date of this thing? It was published. It was published fairly well in '07. And it's the earliest intact document of Bateson, Haley, Weakland, Fry, Bateson, Haley, Jackson talking, okay? And in that transcript, let me just read this to you. This is from, I'm trying to remember when February 9, 1955. Okay, this is Bateson talking. I just want to read this. I know you're not children. This isn't a bedtime story, but it's edifying, and it has everything to do with Wittgenstein. Bateson, you can say a dog learns to be an instrumentalist, or he learns to be an instrumental avoidance operator rather than an instrumental seeker, and so on. We have that language available. Then we have Wittgenstein, 53, and he's referring to the book Philosophical Investigations is the name of Wittgenstein's book. And the phrase language games. And by language game, Wittgenstein means an ongoing system of interaction between persons involving both messages and actions. He assumes that A wants to build a house and that A gives orders to B, but then B then performs certain actions which have to be observed by A, and so on. There is an understanding between A and B of that sort of an interaction. This is, and there will be many such sorts. One ritual, now, ritual, purposive, continued action, operations, competitive operations, and so forth, and we have been assuming that metaphor versus literalness, teasing, making myths, all these various sorts of things are just a part of the language game, are different sorts of language games. The play then becomes the subgroup of the general word game. The word game is unfortunate because, so we got rid of the word game, language game about 2 weeks ago, and substituted the words modes of communication, communication modes, to differentiate such differences as between a play, not play, fantasizing, ritualizing, and so forth. One, I find it useful to know that this is about 2 years before, what's this, 55? This is about 2 years before Toward a Theory of Schizophrenia was published, which I, and certainly agree with many, think that was the beginning of this distinct field. I could go on, it's a longer quote, but I love that in the Bateson team, Wittgenstein was in the thick of it from the very beginning. And that's, we had talked about the relationship between MRI, or MRI as a metaphor for Palo Alto. And it's deep. And Steve was, if he was anything, he was deep. This was a thoughtful, guy that liked to make and drink beer, and anyway.
Well,
so
philosophy and cookbooks,
yes.
and detective stories. Those were the two.
That's right. He even said in another. I spent all day today looking at films, and that's why at one point he was being asked a question. What do you want to be doing? He says, to be honest, I wish I was writing mystery novels. Anyway.
Fascinating. Well, this might be better for you, Yvonne. Was there a sense, like as Wendel's reading that quote, and the reliance on philosophy and language and Wittgenstein's work, was there a sense that borrowing metaphors from this place for psychotherapy was just revolutionary? And can you speak a little to that sense of, was there something in the air when they were paying such attention to language and really breaking free from all of the psychobabble of psychoanalytic work and some of the other approaches to therapy that were prominent at the time? It just seems like such an unusual place to look for psychotherapy, but in another way, not so much.
Well, I think it, at least for me, it was very refreshing. And de Shazer was, and Berg too, were both minimalists. And so it was a stance that was really very rule-driven in one sense. You know, just like language games are pretty rule-driven, you know, in a Wittgensteinian sense. And so if you deliberately either set aside all these hypotheses about the client, or it didn't matter if you succeeded in setting them aside, as long as you behaved as if you had set them aside, suddenly this big space opened intellectually that allowed you to really explore with the client a great deal about the client's life, because you would go on a really a life journey with the client, where you would go through all the aspects of the client's life, looking for any times that things were a little bit better or more manageable. And in many ways, this was sort of a life search, but it was a very strange way to do one, because it wasn't based on a hypothesis or a theory. It was based on what the client wanted, and assuming it was something that the therapist and client could agree on, you know, and sometimes there was some negotiation about that. But then you went and really looked through the client's whole life, and it might be past, wasn't just present or in future. When I think about it now, I think that it was really kind of a bizarre and refreshing journey to just set all that aside. And Insu had been psychodynamically trained.
Insu was?
Yeah, she was trained to be a psychoanalyst. And what Steve said, that I think Paul and Wendel really kind of fits with this, is he said that, you know, while he was very engaged in this Wittgensteinian way of setting aside all interpretations and just observing and describing, Insu should just go like that. But it worked together very well, because Steve said that was essentially what Insu did. She was very much with the client. And during the last year of his life, he said to Terry and I, he said, you know, I spent most of my career observing and trying to faithfully describe what Insu Kim Berg does, which he does therapy, in such a way that other people could replicate it. And he said, I think I've just about succeeded.
Wow.
And so he felt, and I think rightfully so, that she embodied, you know, a sort of a Wittgensteinian, very pure use of language. But what's hilarious is she had no interest in Wittgenstein at all.
But you see, no, please, I'm sorry. Wittgenstein's whole thinking, as I understand it, and as Bateson describes it here, is all about the nature of interaction,
Yeah.
as though it's following rules.
Yeah.
That is so consonant with all of the work of the MRI, or pre-brief therapy center MRI, because MRI really, you can, I think, in three. I see the Palo Alto team as in at least three eras: the pre-MRI Bateson team, the early MRI, and then the Brief Therapy Center forward. And in those first two, it was all about the nature of interaction. And one of the things John Weakland said about Steve is, and he said, I can't remember which of these books. I think it's Steve's, is Clues or Keys, the third book. I don't remember. He said, well, look at the dates. In the third book, I think. Yeah, Clues. Steve said, John says of Steve, is the highest compliment I think anyone could give. He says that what Steve is, and when you talk about Steve, from my frame of reference, that's the side of a coin, Steve on one side, Enzo on the other, okay? Is they are looking at taking the nature of interaction and then what do you do with it, and especially moving into what are the solutions. That and John really thought that in advance. And in this forward in Clues, John says the two groups that are, he thinks, time will show where the real advances of the interactional view developed at Palo Alto was Steve and Enzo's moving into solutions and the Milan teams looking at circularity. And I couldn't agree more. I just think that certainly my whole, when I'm talking career, the people that I look at, the early Palo Alto BTC, Steve and Enzo, Yvonne, needless to say. It isn't just Steve and Enzo. There's like a whole worldwide web of solutions.
Yeah, there's a lot of us.
And the Milan people, who, because they most have recently died, you don't hear as much about, at least in the States, but they're pretty present in Europe. So anyway, this idea of interaction in the current moment. Another thing that came to my mind was Steve, the first decade that I went to MRI, I've been going to MRI a very long time. And anytime I got a chance, I would go to the trainings, right? Paul, Dick, and John. And they invariably used to start their programs by saying, a dedication to, obviously, Milton Erickson's hypnosis, Don Jackson's pragmatic approach, and Bateson's theoretical. Well, in Bateson in Steps, no, it's in Mind and Nature, he outlines 3 different ways that are connected: description, explanation, and the tautology that connects the two, and really makes the case for sticking with description. And anyway, I like that piece connected to the Wittgenstein, the nature of games, the nature and the precarious of using the word game because it has meanings that he did not mean.
That's right.
He was talking about the nature of interaction in the moment, out of which emerges whatever. And that's all now called first order, second order, depending on what circle you're in. So I live my life in cybernetics land. That's first and second order cybernetics in the simultaneity of the moment. And that's where Steve lived his life, I think. Trying to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think also that Steve was a fascinating, as a clinician and as a person, a fascinating combination of a real pragmatist and an intellectual. So he kind of had both. I mean, he was very influenced by Wittgenstein, but also remember that he and Insu and their team spent literally thousands of hours observing videotapes of clients and therapists and carefully noting anything that was useful and discarding the rest. So that was a very pragmatic part of them too. And I think that at least for me, what's very fascinating is he fit those two ways of looking at things together. And he saw Wittgenstein's work in some ways as a way of simplifying and ordering all that information, and it just fascinates me that he looked at it that way and was able to make that very useful to the rest of us.
It's an interesting combination, as you say, to be very informed intellectually in a very dense sort of way with Wittgenstein's work, but then to be a minimalist at the same time. I find that interesting.
It's almost paradoxical, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in a book that Steve and I edited together, Evolving Brief Therapy, Steve wrote the first paper it's on John Weakland, called "The Art of Doing Nothing." And he talks about the capacity for putting in, what's involved in being in the presence of someone who they call a client, right? I want to go back to this earlier paper. It's Bateson again. This is again from 55, right? Bateson says, and it totally pertains here. Therefore, when you say you want a list, they were talking about Wittgenstein's making lists. Okay, it looks to me very much as though you want a list. What you want a list of is the identifiable interactional sequence, which could be the basis of characterological adjectives, or of deuteral learning, or of the specification of the language game. I think the Palo Alto team devoted their entire time together to that. And I think and I know Steve was in MRI, and not MRI, he was in Palo Alto at least by the 60s. Now listen, the first time I saw this excuse me, this transcript, John Weakland in his office, I think there were 6 of them, black folders. They're up on his bookshelf, and I said, "What are those?" And he said, "Those are the transcripts of the Bateson research team meetings." I'm salivating because I'm thinking, "Oh my God, you're kidding me." Well, listen, I know how much time Steve spent with John.
Yeah, they love that.
In that office, in that MRI, and at his home. So I can't imagine how Steve didn't have access to these transcripts. The very first one's the one I'm just mentioning. And Steve really was a studious man, and I guess shy is appropriate, but I wish there was another word to flesh out what's attempted to be captured by using that word shy. Because yes, he was reserved, held back, perhaps, but that doesn't mean this wasn't going a million miles.
Oh, not at all.
I mean, the guy was just, to me, so impressive as a person.
He really was, and he had a wonderful sense of humor.
Oh my God! Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right. And I think he and his friend, I'm not making this up. I've heard Steve describe John as his mentor. And
I have to. He definitely described Steve. I mean, Steve definitely, on more than one occasion, described John Weakland as his mentor. And
they're peas in a pod because they're very quiet.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they're unassuming.
Yes.
More interested in the work than they are in the whatever might go along with that.
More interested in the work than the prestige.
I'm sorry?
More interested in their work than any prestige.
Absolutely. And it was like a magnet. If you really wanted to learn something, sit in a room with somebody like that.
Yeah. Well, they're both elegant communicators. Both Steve and John were very elegant communicators. I mean, very precise with their language.
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was watching, as again inspired by this little dry run we did yesterday, Yvonne, Terry Trepper, and Paul and I've been watching films. I've been watching films from all the films I have at hand, but a lot were from a '93 conference we had in New Orleans. And trying to get John to go on record on something is amazing, because he's always asking, could you tell me more about what you mean? Could you explain that a little bit more? And the next thing you know, you've got someone just revealing so flushing out where they're coming from. That was John. That was
so
Steve.
safe for people to do that. He made it very safe. People felt very safe with him.
Absolutely.
And strangely with Steve, but Steve was somebody who would ask a question and he would look at the ceiling when the client was answering. And he would do that very much like like the saxophone player he was. And clients would feel that he was with them. And clients would say that. And I never understood how that worked. I observed it many times until Steve was good friends with Matthias Varga Kibben. And Matthias said, you know, when he does that, I always have a feeling he's suffering along with the client when the client is struggling. And clients would say so much, and kind of like they did with John. You know, people would go on and give so much information. And Steve did it differently, and yet also like John, in that he created this space where the client would just say so much.
That's right.
And a client would talk much more than the therapist in the case of John or Steve. I think Steve aspired to do that as John did it.
Absolutely, I think they did, and I have the same. I have a very similar experience with them. I'm sorry, y'all. These phones.
I'm guessing that there was almost that sense that we have an honor and a respect for clients, and the more we say, the more we can potentially influence people. And I'm guessing that goes back to Bateson's work, and too much influence or conscious purpose can do harm. And I'm guessing that they were both impacted by some of those ideas.
Well, you know, that's a deep statement you just made. Conscious purpose is a hairy little critter, and I don't know how you. And it's well worth a lot of thought. Conscious purpose. You know, Eve Lipchick, who was another absolute master member of that early team, wrote one of the. It's required reading here. If I had tattoos, if I was a tattoo guy, I'd take her whole paper and make it a body tattoo. It's called. The name of it, though, is Purposeful Interviewing. Mm-hmm. You know, you don't. I don't think she was advocating a willy-nilly experience. And I think she was such an intricate member, like Yvonne had said earlier, Michelle Weaver Davis, Gingrich, Molnar. There was a team on their I think it's 86, their paper where they lay out in Family Process, where they lay out the model. Are you a co-author on that?
No,
Yvonne?
no.
It's the entire team.
That's a groupie.
But anyway, these people were, I think, exceedingly purposeful.
Yeah.
You know, that's John's paper. I'm sorry. Steve's paper about John. The art of doing nothing. There is a lot involved in what not to do.
Yeah.
And I think Steve was an absolute master. And when you read him, in telling you what are the parameters of what one might do, it's full of all the things that by doing that you're not doing.
Yeah. You exclude. Yeah. So it always felt to me like clearing away the clutter. And I also know that Steve and Eve Lipchick had a very satisfying intellectual relationship that I think that was very rich. You know, they had wonderful conversations.
That week that I got the wonderful opportunity to spend in Milwaukee with them, I spent most of my time with Eve. And I'm not sure why. Maybe I was, you know, it's as though they had a very structured 40-hour time frame, right? But Eve just happened to be there a lot more, and maybe that was why. But she's no joke. She's a if you want to get out of whatever the mud hole you're stuck in, go to talk to somebody like her, or Steve, or Enzo,
Right.
or Yvonne for that matter.
Something that you touched on before, Wendell, in earlier. There's a sense, I think, or misunderstanding that a lot of us have, because I'll include myself in that group, that Steve was the theoretician and Insu was the clinician. And the more that I speak with you and Yvonne, and the more research that I do, I realize that that wasn't the case, that Steve was very much the clinician as well.
I'm always deferential to Yvonne. I'll tell you right now. But I think because Steve's name is on the books, frankly, I think that could lend to a naive person. And God willing, we're all naive. It's hard to be naive in today's world, but strive for it. It's a good thing, actually. That's where I partially and improperly, when at times myself, have talked about Steve being the bad word, theoretician, a word he didn't like. Yvonne sorted me out on that yesterday. And Enzo was just a natural clinician. But when you watch Steve work, wow. I mean, wow. That's all I got to say. I love watching him.
Well, Steve had a very deliberate, thoughtful way of working that was, on the surface, totally different than Enzo. But the actual structure of the session was almost identical. And when I first noticed this, I remember talking to Steve about how you could take the same quilt pattern and give it different colors or different fabrics, and it would look totally different. But it was the same pattern. He said, "Oh, yeah, you understand that." So that would be a good way to teach it. You should teach it that way. And Steve was a very serious clinician. You know, it was a very important thing for him if he was going to sit with somebody, just be fully present. And maybe we shouldn't describe Steve as shy, although he described himself as shy. It was something we used to laugh about because we had it in common. Maybe we should describe him more as somebody who took emotions so seriously that it was kind of exhausting to talk a lot about emotions. He took feelings more seriously, I think, than most people, in the sense of the language used to describe feelings and how one responded to feelings. And he felt very strongly that feelings should not be made into things, another Wittgensteinian idea, but that they should always be situated in the context of you know, the environment in which they took place, whether it was a relationship, a relational interaction, or whether it was some life condition. And it really gave the client and the therapist a lot more room to maneuver in terms of looking for ways for the client to know that they were going in the direction the client wanted to go. A lot more freedom.
And paying attention to that.
Yeah.
And that's what, and now we got to talk about Milton Erickson, because Erickson, one of the, my memory doesn't work in some precise way, thank God. But my earliest recollections of Yvonne was as a neo-Ericksonian, someone who I think I stumbled across you in a book, obviously, reading something you've written. Is, I'm sure, the first time as I learned about Steve, was reading. I think I think you and Steve, John, many others, are so have absorbed Milton Erickson in many of the things we're describing. Erickson was exceedingly capable as an observer, you know, and when you observe, it isn't just with your eyes. He's picking everything. and could be wrong, but with the experience that he had, he was most often his observations and then the questions that he would ask to narrow. I see that in Steve. I see it all over Steve. And I'm not making this up. In their lobby, it may have just been coincidental. It might have been rearranging the furniture. I was only there a week, so who knows. But the only photograph in the front room where people walked in the door was like a 3x5 photo, like a Kodak, of Milton Erickson sitting in his wheelchair. That just down to the ground, that impressed me. You know, it's like you're showing things that are important to you.
Yeah.
And in your surroundings, right?
I think it was an important influence, and I also think that a lot of people don't know that one of Steve's first articles was an article about an Ericksonian approach to treating sexual dysfunction.
Yes, that's right.
Developed a lot of hypnosis journals.
What did you say?
Well, a lot of his first papers in the mid '70s were in American Journal of Hypnosis and things like that I've found.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, as a matter of fact, Scott Miller. This is just for anyone who cares. In the Journal of Systemic Therapies, Volume 13, Number 1, 1994, Scott Miller and Larry Hopwood did a comprehensive guide of publications of the Brief Family Therapy Center. It was published in JST, and it lists all these early papers, not just of Steve, but Inzu, and if you want to, like here, the earliest paper I can find of de Shazer is titled "On Getting Unstuck: Some Change Initiating Tactics," and so he's hit the lid in '74, and if you really want to do a deep dive into Steve beyond his books, I'll guarantee you these papers are available because I went and got them, and you can start with this bibliography.
Yeah, so did Steve spend time with Milton Erickson for any extended length of time, or did he infuse?
Somebody took that photograph. I don't know how much. Erickson died in '79, isn't that right? I think it's '79. Might have been '80. So it means he was around, right?
I know that Steve really respected Dr. Erickson's work, and I think later Steve used to say that he didn't think the hypnosis was necessary. On the other hand, as a hypnotherapist, I was always a little bit amused by that because when we ask people a miracle question, we ask the client to suspend normal reality and to go into a detailed description of an alternative future.
That's right. That's right. And you are deep into the operation,
which is one of the most beautiful, externally, I suppose, focused trance. The client's right there with you, and internally too, because they're going on a search, And so I've had several people tell me that they thought both Insu and Steve were two of the most gifted hypnotherapists they'd ever seen when they would ask the miracle question and ask these questions. But certainly, it was not intentionally hypnotic in their case. I just think that he utilized that common everyday trance that occurs, I think, in various optimal times in a person's functioning. And I think when somebody really does thoughtfully answer a question in which they imagine their life becoming better, it is an optimal experience. And people do have a very useful sort of suspension of reality that's trance-like. So in that sense, I think, you could describe his work that way. He would be furious with me if I did describe it that way, so I won't. But it could be described that way.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in for a moment and remind people that if they have any questions for Yvonne or Wendel, that if you're watching on YouTube, you can post a question on our Google Plus page or through YouTube or through the MFT Worldwide portal as well. So if you have any questions for them before we're done tonight, I'd love to convey them and hear what they have to say. Along the lines of what you were just saying, Yvonne, about him being furious. They both, Insu and Steve, lived long enough to see their work really make an impact in mental health and certainly in family therapy programs. Those of us in academia, we teach solution-focused ideas and strength-based ideas, and we show videos of Insu. But they both lived long enough to sort of see the work be misunderstood in some ways. And I guess I'm wondering if either of you had interactions with them where they spoke to how some of the subtlety and depth of solution-focused work is missed on the casual student who just happens to read a paper or hear a lecture here and there.
Well, they were never really furious about anything that I ever saw. Sometimes they were disappointed. And I think that sometimes they were saddened that the solution-focused therapy model sometimes had been presented in such a rigid way that it appeared that you could only talk about the present or only say positive things and not talk about the past, because that's inaccurate. And the fact was, people were encouraged to talk about the past as much as is helpful, but they were not forced to do so. And so I think sometimes they were disappointed that about the misconceptions, but I think that they spent very little time ever dwelling on that. They were both incredibly pragmatic people who were always more interested in finding out what they could do or say that might help understanding or might make things a little bit better in their immediate environment. They really, in that way, lived that approach. I mean, nobody can live an approach completely, but I think
sure, but it makes sense that they would not focus on that as a problem.
Yeah, they really didn't. They were very, just very curious, and they were very supportive of the idea that this is an approach that would look different with different therapists, and that needed to be adjusted to the client rather than vice versa.
Gotcha. Well, we have a question from MFT Worldwide. Question is, how is Steve connected to the development of the miracle question, and is it something that he and Insu developed together? Do either of you know that?
I have my 2 cents about it, but I'm also completely wanting to hear what Yvonne has to say, too.
Well, what Steve and Insu told me was it came up in Insu's work out of desperation. Insu was working with a woman who had been horrifically battered and abused, and she was somebody who was in and out of women's shelters. And as probably a lot of the listeners know, it's really hard sometimes for women who are abused to break out of that sort of a revolving door. They return to the abuser, and it's hard to intervene too. And Insu said, well, what can we do today that would be helpful, or most helpful? And the client said, I don't know. It would take a miracle. And Insu, who listened very carefully, as did Steve always, said, so if we had a miracle, what would be different? And that was the idea that you could, of the client's ideas, there was always some little piece that could help the client move forward. So that's how it started. And since Steve and Insu and their team observed anything that was helpful and that appeared to be helpful, they preserved that and continued to do so. Now, since then, there have been conjectures that, well, maybe they knew about it, because it was an intellectual idea that had been around. But I know that in their experience, that's where it started.
Okay, one of the beautiful things about reading these forwards of Steve's books was one of the things he emphasizes is not getting caught in an either-or dichotomy, not getting caught in saying this is right, the only right, and everything else is opposite. So I love that story, that the articulation of Inzu's telling of her finding miracle. Here's another one. So they're just a different one. I spend a lot of my time watching films of the MRI brief therapy team. John, Steve, not John, well, not Steve, I'm sorry, Dick and Paul. And often, so we're talking movies from the late 70s, early 80s. Before then, it's audio recordings. Okay, so we got those too. But if you want to watch films, it's probably beginning early 80s. And there's occasions when someone will almost use the miracle question, but not quite, right? So that's a backdrop. And I know Steve was around. I mean, I know before the words miracle question entered the lexicon is the period that I'm talking about. Okay. Then there was a conversation, I got this on tape. I was asking John about it. And he said, this is my poor approximation of what John said. He said that the miracle question is the same end of session technique, my word, not his, that John, routinely use at the end of a well-done first MRI brief therapy session. The question is asked, what if it were to happen would let you know not that the problem's solved, but that it's just right around the corner, and let me be clear, smaller is better. And then the last part of a well-done first MRI-BT interview is all about getting people, often people say, well, the problem would be solved. They'd say, well, yes. I'm talking way before that. So that you would be given as an end-of-session task to go out and be mindful, a new word, right? Well, new. Buddha's had it for a couple of thousand years, but in our lexicon, a lot of people use the word mindful. Before that was one of the words popularly used. John would say, I want you to think about that, and I'll see you next week. And that's how he would end an interview. Then he said, this is John describing the connection between miracle question and MRI brief. He said, Steve and Inzu took that idea and flipped it, because instead of starting with what would be the small thing, you might notice, they would say, you wake up the next morning and a miracle has happened, okay? Okay, what would you notice first? And then there's a whole series of queries that expand the idea of what a miracle could look like, right? And John, he just did a marvelous job of talking about it's almost like in a continuum with the MRI brief way of starting with small. Mm-hmm. And the miracle question procedure, really, it's not a question. Mm-hmm. And it started with a miracle. So anyway, I'm doing a poor job of it. I got to go. I should transcribe that.
On the contrary, Wendel, you're doing a great job. Just to listen to you both speak about...
They're very connected. These ideas, the miracle cue and what would be the first thing, because even in the miracle question procedure, the moment they say it, you start getting them to say, what would that look like? What would you see? What would you notice? And then you go from that person to the other people to the end.
Well, and I hear John Weakland's influence in the way solution-focused therapists use the miracle question, because Steve would ask, let's suppose the miracle happened. What would be, and he would go on further than that, but then what would be the first small sign, the smallest sign? Now later in Steve and Insu's career, they started asking it a little differently. They would say, how would you discover that a miracle had happened and the problem was gone? Or how would you discover it had gone? And what would be the first small sign? You kind of hear John in the background,
And Yvonne, listen, this is such a cool thing, because Steve and Inzu were just so, what's the right word? They were pioneers of how to get things in motion. I remember Steve talking about the first thing you say to somebody on the telephone when they call in to make the interview, and saying to people, on the premise that by the time someone calls, things are in motion. This is another thing de Shazer and Weekland very much agree with. The only constant is change. And so I remember, I wish I could remember more clearly, Steve talking about how they had an experiment with the kind of thing you would say to the client to notice even before they come into the first interview. So they used this what used to be the end of procedure query of MRIB brief, flipped it inside out, and then started using it in various places.
Well, I think first of all, the first person I think who did that, at least that Steve noticed, was Michelle Peter Davis. Michelle Peter Davis asked some clients, based on this general idea, did anything happen between scheduling and coming in to make things better? And of course, what happened was quite amazing. You know, the clients said a great many things happened, and Steve was very taken with that. You know, and the whole team was very taken with it, and that became a very important part of the approach. The idea of a pre-session change question. But I hadn't known until you said this that it was mentioned on the phone, and that's also very interesting because of course the contact somebody has is very important. You know, they had I know they had a street front clinic, and they would see pretty much anybody who came through the door. And it was not in the safest neighborhood, you know. And it was just so heartfelt. People were treated just with great respect. It was a wonderful thing.
We're going to go till another half hour or so, Paul? When
we're scheduled to go till 9:30 Eastern, correct.
Okay. I hope we have time to play that short film of Inzu.
Yes.
I don't know I'm not suggesting this is the time.
Let me share.
But I want to be mindful of our time.
Yeah, I want to share the excerpt that you sent to me earlier today for people to see, and maybe you can speak about that.
You want me to set it up now in words?
Yes, okay, that would be great.
We had a conference in 1993 in New Orleans in honor of John Weekland. And Stephen Inzu and I were the organizers. It was a 2-day conference. It was great, 650 people, wonderful. Jay Haley was there a lot. It was cool. This is the very last day, and this is the last panel. And so in it, Inzu is Stephen Inzu have been very centrally involved in the conference, and Inzu saying goodbye, but the pretext for this 5-minute or so video we're going to see of Inzu is it's a conference in honor of John. Anna Weekland, his wife, is there. These are lifelong friends. These two couples. That's your setup.
Okay, so I was going to just share the transcript at this point.
Oh, I thought you were going to show that the movie.
But you know what? Well, I wasn't sure if we would be able to do that, but let's try the transcript first, and
Did you make a transcript? I didn't send you.
No, the one that you sent.
Yeah, a little transcript.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were going to watch Inzu.
Steve routinely.
That's okay, because we're gonna try to see that too, Wendell. So that was very helpful.
Okay. Oh, great.
So you were able to see my screen?
Not yet.
Pretty face.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
There we go.
How about now?
Can you blow that up? Can you zoom in on it? This is a transcript of the first minute and a half, 2.5 minutes, of an interview that Steve did with a young woman. Yvonne had said that there's a method, there's a logic to the beginnings of Steve's interviews. And so what I did was I went and transcribed the first 2.5 minutes of one of those films. We got to get all of our old eyes close enough to see the sea.
Is it too far away to see? I'm not sure what's happening. We're hearing a little echo on Wendel's side.
Yeah.
Can you check your audio, Wendell? Yeah, I think we're getting a feedback loop of the last couple of words that you said. I wonder, Wendell, if you're able to hear us, if you're able to log back out, log out and log back in again. Yes, that would be helpful because we're getting some feedback. Are you still hearing that feedback? Yes.
There.
Oh. All right.
Well, maybe may I comment a little bit about Steve's way of beginning, because this is the transcript nicely exemplifies it.
Yes, please.
Steve had a way of beginning sessions in which he would thank the client for coming, and then he would tell the client that he was going to give them his best, and he hoped they would do the same, and he really hoped it was useful. There were no guarantees, but he hoped it was useful. And that really set the stage for all his sessions, probably for the last 10 years of his life. And I also think it revealed a lot about who Steve was as a clinician.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if you were able to read it when I had it up, so let me just read a little bit of it. So Steve is saying, first of all, I want to thank you for coming. And then he says, I hope it will be useful in some way. And the client says, a friend of mine saw the website and I became absorbed and decided to call, but I don't want to put all of my eggs in one basket. And then Steve said, oh, you better not, because there's no guarantee about this. And the client said, well, regardless of how this goes, since being introduced to this several months ago by Chris, so many things have happened, so many changes. And Steve said, oh, I want to come back to that in a minute. But you said you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. There are no guarantees. Oh, we're back. Wendell is still getting the same feedback. Are you hearing it again, Yvonne? So there's still that same feedback loop of your voice, Wendell, that we're hearing. Not sure what. It stopped when you logged out, and then unusually, as unusual as it sounds, it started up that little feedback loop again. And it actually sounds like it could be part of a rap. We'll give Wendell a minute to work on the technical. I wonder if there's some sort of message that's being sent to us by that little blurb that gets repeated. Well, Wendell logged out again, so hopefully he can log back in. So I'll just finish up what I was saying. Steve said, oh, I want to come back to that in a minute, but you said you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. There are no guarantees, but I can promise you that I will do my best, and I'm sure you will too, and we will see what happens. And the client said, yeah. And then Steve said, you said there have already been so many positive things that have happened even before that. And then it trails off from there. But it's like you both were saying, there was a real reverence and respect for the client, but not necessarily I'm going to fix you and everything's going to be okay when this is over. And I think Wendell would probably agree that sentiment left over from John Weakland of, well, let's see how this goes because there's no guarantees.
Very much, yeah, very much. I think like John Weakland. Also, the idea of going kind of slowly. I think that I mentioned yesterday when we were beginning how John would say to go slow, but Steve would often quote John with his supervisees, of which I was one, and he'd always say, John Weakland would say, go slow. Go slow in this situation. And this situation was pretty much every clinical situation. And of course, it had a wonderful effect because rather than the therapists, the solution-focused therapists being cheerleaders, when solution-focused therapy is done badly, you look like a cheerleader. Come on, you can do it. By going slow, the client generally begins to say, oh, I can, more happen than that, or I can do more than that. So it's a wonderful way of looking at it.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, I don't know if Steve and Insu had ideas about that, but what you're saying really resonates. How do you get training therapists to not go so quickly? Yes, Wendell, hi. You're back?
Hi. Is it better?
Much better, yes.
I'm so glad. I'm sorry.
We're in a very small, strange feedback loop, but it seems to have been taken care of. So whatever you did, bravo.
Well, I shut everything down and came back. But let me say, my technical expert says that another theory could be that your mics are too high and it's looping that way. So I just want to give that as an idea in case we need to do something else.
Doing it again.
It's doing it again.
No, it was actually delayed this time, so that's good. Like, the way they're here is delayed from what you're actually saying.
Well, so never mind. My pro from Dover tells me that it sounds better to his ear. Is it okay on your ear?
It sounds perfect to me now, yes.
In the spirit of solution-focused therapy, Wendell, what were you doing when it was working well?
Asking for help, not relying on myself. I don't like with you and Terry. When you say to Terry, "Terry, help me!" I got a room full of Terrys here.
Well, then that's a very fortunate environment.
Are we back to the transcript? Because
yeah, I had just read the transcript, and we were talking a little bit about Steve's posture with clients, and a little bit of that no guarantees, and Yvonne was saying about going slow. And how, let's think small here, and let's not think too big. When solution-focused therapy isn't really being practiced in a helpful way, when therapists are acting as cheerleaders and wanting to really pull the client along faster than they're ready to.
There's so many elements. That's all true. And it's all so consonant with MRI brief. I sent a short paper to you guys, Yvonne, Paul, that Steve and Inzu wrote, where they basically talk about the similarities between MRI brief and solution focused. But here in this first interview, Yvonne, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you pointing this out. That there is a redundancy, there is a repeating sequence that one can see across interviews of Steve in the first part of an interview. That's just extraordinary. And listen to them, because he starts first by thanking her. First of all, I want to thank you for coming. Client responds. Then Steve says, I hope it'll be useful in some way. Client responds. And then the client says something about getting too excited, being too hopeful about this being helpful. And Steve says, oh, you better not, because there are no guarantees about this. That is that repetition, that could be John Weakland talking.
Yeah.
That part of the rhythm. And then the client says something, she says, again, she's being hopeful. And Steve says, oh, no, listen, oh my goodness. The client says, regardless of how this goes, in response to John saying, don't, how do you put it? You better not, because there are no guarantees. The client comes back and says, well, regardless of how this goes, since being introduced to this several months ago, this approach, so many things have happened, so many changes. Now, what does Steve do? I swear to God, I was at the Windsor when Steve says this. He says, oh, I want to come back to that in a minute. But you said you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, that there are no guarantees. So this is, I was just reading, when you go back to that other paper we had by the Bateson team, one of the presuppositions is with holding people back. Okay? Because, and Yvonne earlier said it in terms of go slow. This is such a characteristic of this approach. And then he goes on further and he says, I'll come back. He's just, how do I want to say this? Him not eagerly going into how things are better, and instead using the rhetorical device of, we'll come back to that in a minute. I've heard him say that a million times.
Absolutely.
And then he says, but then he goes and reiterates, you know, don't get your hopes up, baby. You know, by saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's using the client's language. The client introduced that way of speaking. And then he says, this is what's important. This is another important thing that Yvonne pointed out. Steve then says, I can promise you that I will do my best. I'm sure you will too, and we'll see what happens. The client says, yeah, and then Steve goes back and said, you said there's already been so many positive things that have happened before. And if we could hear that, his tone of voice, his tone of voice is so absolutely curious.
Yeah.
He can't wait to hear what she has to say. And it just gave me chill bumps, because I thought only Inzu had that intonation.
No, they
And
both
yours-
have it. And
yes.
If
You've
they-
got it. Are you kidding me?
I hope so. But the idea that I get when I watch them is that the client is the only person in their world at that moment, the only
Absolutely.
person in their mind, and that's the only thing they're aware of. They're just like that. And I also think the go slow theme often, rather than being said directly, shows up in solution-focused therapy by the emphasis on what would be the smallest sign. And that's both an idea that comes from, I think, the idea of going slow, but it also comes from Wittgenstein's idea of an external signifier. What's something that is a sign, and what is the smallest, most, in a sense, that's the most precise way to describe the beginning of change. The smallest thing that would tell you that things were better. So kind of all those things, and it's very pragmatic. You know, I think it's a kind of an ingenious question.
And it's a totally ingenious question, totally consonant with John, not just John, anyone who's doing a well-done MRI brief approach. And it's what, you don't give people hope. You don't make an effort to be hopeful. You give them, and I'm trying to channel Dick Fish now, implicit hope. The hope that's implied, that comes from having accomplished something. So when someone's saying, what's the smallest thing you could notice, and whatever they now say becomes a big deal. They were able to see that. Anyway, I love this stuff, man.
At the risk of tempting the technology gods, I can try to play the video clip that you sent, Wendel.
Yes.
I'll just need a little thumbs up if it's something that's translating well, or if the audio is off, or don't really know how that's going to come out. So let me try to share my screen and see what happens here.
About 5.5 minutes in.
Yes, I think I found the correct place to start.
You were there, both you guys, in '93.
Oh, Wendel, you
I think you have to be quiet or the mic will flip to you guys. Okay, let's try. Here we go. It's a very svelte-looking Wendel, too.
Upper New York has a brand new little, very interesting newsletter called News of Difference. And those interested in it should pick up one of these little things off of the table out there. It's an excellent little newsletter. It's very inexpensive. It will keep you, it'll put you into a network of people of like mind. I encourage you to pursue it. The cost is negligible. I think that's it for me. Thank you for coming. Another thing, I overlooked this. The people I should thank is you. You responded. Thank you very much. You should give yourself a hand. Now we're going to move on to a few other people who would like to say some closing remarks, and we're going to begin with Inzu Berg.
This works. Believe it or not, I have volunteered to say this, so I have sort of forced my way into this. And I insisted to Wendel that I have to have 5 minutes to say something. And we have been talking about John for these 2 days. And I have been thinking about what is that can I say in addition to what's been said already about John. And what occurred to me was that when I first came to this country in the 50s, there was a lot of a myth about these Oriental women. And I heard a lot of stories about how Oriental women were, and they were really surprising to me because that's not how I saw myself, or that's not how I saw my mother. And so I really, heard a lot of stories about this, like Oriental women walk 5 paces behind their husbands because they are inferior to their husbands. And I guess they really surprised me because of what, the real reason why Oriental women walks 5 paces behind their husbands is so that they could tell their husbands which direction to go. And my contact with John and Anna over the years has sort of it's been somewhat paralleled with my marriage to Steve. And so I like to talk about both sides of this. I think that I have some sense of what it's like for Anna to be married to John. I think what made it sort of work is that they have been in different fields. And I think sometimes Anna would say, the reason that we get along is because we are in a different field and I can't tell him what to do in his own field. Well, not really. But anyway, that's the other side of it. On the other hand, I think that it's knowing, being an Oriental woman, I also know what it takes to live with an Oriental woman, which has a reputation of being very submissive and very quiet and very dominated. Well, not really. I have to tell you that. And so I have some sympathy for Steve, who has to live with me, but I also have sympathy for John, who has to live with Anna. And I sort of got this impression that the reason that these 2 guys get along so well is because they get together and they commiserate about what it's like to be married to these very quiet, submissive Oriental wives. Anyway, so I just wanted to sort of balance what's been said about John by saying, you know, a little bit of tribute about Anna, because it's not easy to live with someone like John, because I sort of know what it's like to live with someone like Steve. So it comes from my personal experience, and I'm sure you understand. I mean, I don't know too much about their private lives, and I think that, you know, John is a very private person, and so is Anna. So I don't want to, you know, I don't know too much about that, but I can sort of, from the inferences and the little things you pick up. And as you know, we all pick up these little subtle things, and we're good at that. And but it takes a great deal of patience and understanding and ability to appreciate being different. That I think that it takes quite a bit of patience and understanding on Anna's part to live with someone like this for all these years. And so I would hope that somehow you give her a hand.
Our next person to give us some closing remarks, who I hope is here.
Yeah. I really appreciate you playing that part of Enzu, even though this is celebrating Steve's birthday, because I just don't know how to talk about Steve without acknowledging Enzu. And she was making that point with Anna Wu about John, right? Thank you so much, Paul, because I miss Enzu as much as I miss Steve.
Yeah, what a treat it is to watch her just speaking about them. And thank you for sharing it with us, Wendel. That's priceless. I didn't know that you had recorded that time.
I record everything, man.
That showed so much foresight. It's incredible.
Yvonne, what are your recollections? What did you think?
Well, I think that it was a wonderful example of Insu's warmth and her playfulness, and her looking at the big picture. These relationships are complex.
Great. Well, so we had said we'd go about an hour and a half. Any closing thoughts? You know, I've been taking a few questions, and you can jump in with any of these that you'd like. One of them was, how do you think Steve would like to be remembered, is one. What do you think is his most enduring contribution, was another question that came through. And any of his ideas that didn't make it into the mainstream. So anywhere you want to jump in with any of those would be fine.
I'm waiting for Yvonne. I have an idea. Mine things I could say, but I want to hear Yvonne.
Well, I think that the best way to understand how Steve would like to be remembered is probably to use Steve's own words. And, as I mentioned earlier, he said in the last few months of his life, he knew that his days were numbered. He was very ill, staying at our house, and he said, I have really tried to accurately describe Insu's work in such detail, meaning her work when she was doing solution-focused brief therapy, that others can replicate it. And I really think that I finally just about succeeded. And I think for him, that description, very pragmatic description that could be followed by anybody who took it seriously, was what he would have considered his biggest legacy. And in that sense, it really fits that we did bring Insu into this, because she was such an integral part of his understanding of the clinical application of this focused approach. And I'm hearing feedback. And I'm
Yep. A little feedback and a little bit of a jumpy camera. How about you? Thank you very much, Yvonne. That was well said. And Wendell, what are your thoughts?
Golly. I don't know. First off, I do think Steve will be remembered not as a person, but as he and John certainly was very clear about this. He thought that Steve's contribution is moving from focusing on interaction, which is MRI's contribution, to focusing on solutions and the language and the preciseness Yvonne has mentioned, and John's careful. I don't like the words. All these words are one dimension. Careful doesn't say it. But he was Steve was exceedingly attentive to how what he was saying was being received by the other, and he could change on it. He could shift on a dime, and in response to the field. I think that skill lives on in the work of the many people that he and into Yvonne and others in this small group of people in their teaching of other people and how to do therapy. That's another incredible compliment Weekland gave of Steve. Steve was interested in how do you do this, and then writing about it in a way that it could be replicated. I think his books are wonderful, his papers are wonderful, so those are part of his legacy. And he liked beer, and he really liked beer. And I like that about him.
Among family therapists, liking beer.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an absolute treat, you two. Just listening to your perspectives and stories. One of the reasons we started this Honoring Pioneers series is because we want to be able to keep the spirit of these people in their lives and their work and pass that along to the next generation of brief and family therapists so that they can carry it on and that these amazing innovators can live on in their work and through the field. So thank you so much for doing this.
Paul, I hope he's around. Yvonne, is Terry around? Can he put his face in the frame for a minute?
I can try. Excuse me.
Yeah, because they're a tag team. They're like Enzo and Steve and Anawu and John.
Terry?
This is Terry Treffer. I'm trying to do it.
Terry Treffer is out with the
Well, since we had this wonderful conversation, talk about Enzo and Steve and John and Anna, I was just thinking, Yvonne, and you know how much I love you. I love Terry too, and I'd like to at least see his face if you could see us.
I think I may have summoned him. Terry?
Oh, hot dog.
Yeah. Well, we love you too, and this has been a great pleasure, Paul. And thank you. And here's
hello, everybody.
Yeah. There you go. Thanks. I appreciate you humoring me. Hey.
I was watching this. Good job, guys.
Here,
Excellent.
That's one of the great couples around. That's it.
Again, thank you again, folks. And we're going to make this video available on YouTube through MFT Worldwide, and certainly I'll get you guys a copy as well if you would. If at any point you want to show it to students, like I hopefully will be able to do, that would be great. So thank you again, and good night for now.
It's an honor. Good night.
great pleasure.
Good night.